Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Magdalena Medley. I am the communications coordinator at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. We are very excited to have you here for this book talk. And I'm gonna introduce right now the man you came to see. So David Phillips, as you know, is the director of the program on peace building and human rights at Columbia University. He served as a senior advisor and foreign affairs expert to the US State Department under President Clinton, Bush, and Obama, which included work on the Future of Iraq project. He's author of 9 books, scores of reports, and hundreds of articles. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion about Frontline Syria from revolution to proxy war. And just so you know, we're going to leave questions for the ending of the presentation. And if you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function for that. And we are recording this event and we'll share the recording after the fact. Thank you.
Maggie, thanks very much for welcoming everyone and for organizing today's event. I'm very pleased to talk about my newest book, Frontline Syria, which is a political and military history of Syria from the Arab Spring to the present. The book serves as an after-action report. It offers lessons learned and policy recommendations. Scholarly work is of little comfort to the Syrian people, so it's very practical in its analysis and offering recommendations. Nearly 500,000 people have been killed and 12 million rendered homeless since 2011. Syria's grinding civil war is ongoing. It's hard to imagine that 10 years have passed since students in Dara painted graffiti on the wall of their high school, criticizing Bashar al-Assad and demanding democracy. They were caught up in the enthusiasm of the Arab Spring, which heralded sweeping changes across the Middle East. However, in Dara, the police arrested and tortured the students. When people gathered outside the Dara police station to demand their release, Assad's security forces shot and killed 100 of them. Protests involving 100,000 people swept across the country. In response, Assad initially took a conciliatory approach. He released dozens of political prisoners, dismissed government officials involved in the crackdown, including the governor of Hama, and he lifted the 48-year-old state of emergency in Syria. These gestures did not placate the opposition. Assad sent troops to restore order, which merely accentuated the spiral of deadly violence. Army officers defected from the Syrian Arab Army and created the Free Syrian Army. It was mobilized in response to Bashar al-Assad's atrocities, using chemical weapons and barrel bombs against civilians. Of course, Assad is primarily responsible for Syria's national tragedy. There is, however, plenty of blame to go around. Turkey supported the rebels, Islamicizing the secular pro-democracy opposition. Russia rescued the Assad regime, providing security assistance, deploying the Wagner Group and other mercenaries, as well as diplomatic cover at the UN. Russia coordinated its military intervention with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Shiite militias such as Hezbollah. Syria's tragedy was compounded by the failure of US leadership. Early in the conflict, President Obama declared that Assad must go, but he didn't have a plan for his removal or for facilitating a successor state. According to Bill Burns, who's written an endorsement of the book and is now the head of the CIA, we misaligned ends and means, promising too much on the one hand and applying tactical tools too grudgingly and incrementally on the other. My talk today will focus on Washington's numerous shortcomings. Obama refused to enforce his red line when the regime attacked using chemical weapons in 2013. The Obama administration dithered over the decision to provide lethal support to the opposition. Washington's failure to effectively support opposition groups resulted in their radicalization. Russia's rise enhanced the role of Iran and Turkey, and the US failed to support Syrian Kurds, our only friends and allies in Syria. In Syria, we've seen the Syrian Democratic Forces join in the battle against ISIS at America's request. 11,000 Syrian Kurds died as a result, and 23,000 were seriously injured. So the Syrian Kurds paid a steep price and got very little in return. Let me focus initially on a discussion about the use of chemical weapons. In August of 2013, US intelligence satellites observed Syrian forces readying artillery and surface-to-surface missiles tipped with sarin and mustard gas. Obama indicated in his public remarks that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line that would change my calculus. His remarks were intended as a warning to Assad rather than a threat of US intervention. At least 1,400 civilians were killed, including 429 children, in an attack on the Damascus suburb of Ghouta on August 21, 2013. The Assad regime, of course, denied that they had used chemical weapons. Syrian officials claimed it was a false flag incident, that the opposition fired on civilians to garner international support for its cause. The Ghouta attack does not stand alone. It was one of 14 chemical weapons incidents that summer. In response, Secretary of State John Kerry made an offhand comment about engaging the UN to identify and dispose of Syria's weapons of mass destruction. The wily and shrewd foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, pounced on the idea. Making Syria's WMD a matter for the UN put the US and Russia on equal footing. It strengthened Assad by making him a partner in disposing of Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. The US and Russia co-sponsored UN Security Council Resolution 2118 on September 27, 2013. The resolution condemned the use of chemical weapons and designated the International Atomic Energy Agency to take a leading role in eliminating Syria's WMD. Assad reacted to the resolution by agreeing to hand over Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. He feigned cooperation with the IAEA while pursuing a policy of cheat and retreat. By June of 2013, he claimed that Syria's chemical weapons stockpile had been destroyed. That was a lie, which was proven by events going forward. For example, in April of 2017, Assad launched a new chemical weapons attack on Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib province, killing 80 people. Trump ordered airstrikes on the airfield from which the CW was launched and imposed sanctions on 271 people implicated in Syria's weapons program. The pinprick strikes did nothing. Within 24 hours, the tarmac had been repaired and Syria's chemical weapons operation was back in business. Less than a year later, eastern Ghouta suffered more chemical weapons attacks. Predictably, the opposition was deeply disappointed by Kerry's invitation to Russia and the engagement of the UN. It hoped that the Ghouta attack would spark moral outrage and put pressure on the US to intervene militarily. The opposition doubted Assad's stated commitment to disarmament, warning that chemical weapons supplies had been distributed around the country and were hidden from IAEA inspectors. Washington's tepid response radicalized the opposition. It also created an opportunity for deeper involvement by nefarious actors who were hostile to the West. In response to the chemical weapons attacks in Ghouta in 2013, the US Senate adopted Senate Resolution 21, calling for the establishment of safe zones and authorizing the use of military force. A debate ensued about who would receive support and the type of support they would be provided. The opposition initially adhered to democratic and pluralistic principles. Members of the Syrian Arab Army defected to join the rebels, enhancing the FSA's fighting capabilities. The FSA's initial goal was to protect peaceful protesters. It expanded this objective to target regime symbols and to adopt measures aimed at overthrowing the regime, bringing about a regime change in Syria that would allow Syrians greater opportunity for democracy and human rights. Let's talk for a minute about the Free Syrian Army. The FSA was founded in July 2011, and it started as a decentralized rebel movement. It was an inclusive, popular movement comprised of Arabs and minorities, Alawites, Kurds, Armenians, Christians, and others. Its ranks included secular nationalists, jihadists, and Salafists. They were joined by foreign fighters animated by the Arab Spring to join the fight in Syria. The fractured nature of the movement was exacerbated by the need for financing as groups aligned their ideology with the views of potential sponsors. Secular nationalists sought a rights-based democratic order. They believed that Islam was compatible with democratic institutions and practices such as constitutionalism, elections, and a multi-party system. As fighting dragged on, jihadists gained prominence. Jihadists sought to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with a modern nation state. In January of 2012, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, a member of al-Qaeda in Iraq, formed the Nusra Front in Syria. He posted a video declaring Sharia law and calling for the overthrow of Assad. Salafists believe that Sharia is absolute and that deviating from the Quran is strictly forbidden. They aspire to an Islamic state or caliphate in Syria. The Obama administration's support for the opposition wavered as jihadists and Salafists became more prominent in the insurgency. Atrocities dissuaded the US from getting more involved. For example, a member of the Omar al-Farouk Brigade was filmed cutting out the heart and liver of a government soldier and eating the heart while it was still beating. He exclaimed, "I swear to God, we will eat your hearts out, you soldiers of Assad." Bashar used the video to his advantage to support his claim that the regime was a bulwark against violent sectarianism and warranted international support. The US was reluctant to provide lethal weapons and training to the opposition. It feared a recurrence of what happened in Afghanistan, where the US supported the Taliban against Soviet occupation, providing Stinger missiles that were later turned against the US. Officials undertook a time-consuming vetting process to qualify recipients of lethal weapons. Debate in the interagency process was interminable. One US official I interviewed described it as paralysis through analysis. Instead of lethal assistance, which is what the opposition wanted desperately, the US provided meals that were ready to eat, MREs, night vision goggles, communications gear, medical supplies, and vehicles. So-called moderate opposition with which the US was aligned was fighting on three sides. They were fighting against the Syrian Arab Army of the government, the Al-Qaeda influenced Nusra Front, and also against ISIS. The Obama administration determined that ISIS was the greatest threat and emphasized support to groups fighting Daesh over those fighting the regime. In fact, Obama himself disparaged the FSA, calling them doctors, farmers, and pharmacists. Not an accurate presentation of the FSA, who were on the front lines fighting and dying for regime change. In Washington, an informal Arms for Rebels group emerged through the interagency process. David Petraeus, who headed the CIA at the time, and Hillary Clinton argued for robust engagement. Ambassador Robert Ford, the US ambassador in Damascus, who was recalled as fighting worsened, noted the consequences of delaying support for the rebels. He warned that a humanitarian crisis would worsen, intensifying displacement and refugee flows. He argued that US adversaries and malign powers would fill the gap created by the US. In fact, Ambassador Ford proved to be correct on all those counts. The opponents of lethal assistance were cautious, noting uncertainty about the day after Assad. Through the bureaucracy of the US government, there were plenty of naysayers who were concerned what would happen once Assad was removed. They warned of reprisals and revenge killing, and that a successor regime would emerge that could be even worse. There's always tension within the US government between the proponents of reform and those who place stability above all else. In 2014, Obama relented and authorized an overt train and equip program run by US Special Forces. The goal was to train 5,000 fighters in Turkey to fight against ISIS. The Pentagon spent $500 million with little result. In a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator John McCain asked for an assessment of the program's impact. General Lloyd Austin, who's now the Secretary of Defense, was questioned. The hearing took place on September 16th of 2015, and Austin admitted, much to everyone's shock, we're talking about maybe 4 or 5 rebels that are combat ready. American taxpayers who had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to prepare rebels were dismayed at the lack of progress. In parallel, the CIA launched a clandestine program to back rebels against Assad. About 170 Syrians were trained at a base in Reyhanli, just on the Turkish side of the border with Syria. When they entered Syria in July of 2015, news of their travel leaked, and they were massacred by the Nusra Front as soon as they were in Syria. The train and equip activities of the US government proved to be a total fiasco, measured in terms of battlefield readiness. Sunni opposition was embittered by the lack of support, which compounded the failure of international diplomacy to end the war. Let me turn now to diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire and to end violent conflict. In the fall of 2012, many US officials felt that Assad was on the ropes and that he'd be gone by year's end. I remember having discussions with US officials at that time, and they were convinced that Assad would fall. The opposition had momentum, and the opposition was closing in on Damascus. The US was careful not to discredit the opposition by having its fingerprints on the goal of regime change. Resolution 2118, which authorized the International Atomic Energy Agency's involvement, also called for intensified international diplomacy to end the war. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, was appointed the special envoy of both the UN and the Arab League. He developed the Geneva Communique, which Fred Hoff, a US official, described as a diplomatic masterpiece. The Geneva Communique was a 6-point plan that serves as a roadmap for a ceasefire and sustainable peace. Kofi presented his 6-point plan to the UN Security Council on March 15 of 2012. However, Assad, ignored pleas by the international community for confidence building measures. He rejected a ceasefire and refused to withdraw forces from urban areas. Russia, in turn, vetoed a series of resolutions in the Security Council intended to ratchet up pressure on Assad. Coffey lamented, quote, the destructive competition between world powers, and he resigned on August 2, 2012. This phase of diplomacy, developing and promoting the six-point plan, was known as Geneva 1. Coffey was replaced by Lakhdar Brahimi, another world-class diplomat who had served as Algeria's foreign minister and was the architect of the Taif Accords that ended Lebanon's civil war through a power-sharing arrangement between Lebanon's sectarian groups. Under Brahimi's leadership, the UN took a dual-track approach: dialogue between Syrian rebel factions and between Damascus and the rebels. Syrians were hopelessly divided. A huge chasm existed between Syrians in country who were under siege and Syrians who were out of the country and who set up shop at five-star hotels in Istanbul. This phase of diplomacy, called Geneva 2, was viewed as a success because just convening the meeting was a small accomplishment. However, Ban Ki-moon lamented Geneva 2's failure as a, quote, tragedy for the Syrian people, and he called it a failure of the UN. In June of 2012, the US and Russia met at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. They issued a statement. It refused to assign responsibility for Syria's violence or call for Assad to step down. This moral equivalency was deeply disappointing to the armed opposition. Russia and China vetoed Resolution 10534 that was introduced on December 31st of 2012. The resolution called for a more robust international involvement in finding a solution to Syria's civil war. France was outspoken as a permanent member of the Security Council, calling for Assad to step down. However, Russia's UN ambassador, a tough diplomat named Vitaly Churkin, claimed that 10534 violated Syria's sovereignty and could be used as a pretext for military action. Then the Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman, met her Russian counterpart, who was crystal clear in the message he conveyed to Ambassador Sherman. We will not pressure Assad to step down, said the Russian. Given Russia's recalcitrance, they settled on the establishment of a transitional governing body to oversee elections. That was a far cry from the robust response that Washington was hoping for. Russia was wary of what's happened in Libya. UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians while barring a foreign occupation force of any form on any part of Libya's territory. Russia did not veto the resolution on Libya. It abstained. A US official in the National Security Council coined the phrase leading from behind. The US supported Libyan rebels who hunted down Muammar al-Gaddafi and executed him by the side of the road, but the US was not directly involved in the Libyan conflict. Other countries like Norway were directly involved. In the Syria context, international diplomacy failed because the US and Russia were at loggerheads. There's a Swahili proverb, and when the elephants are at war, the grass suffers most. That was certainly true in Syria. Washington supported the rebels while Russia backed the regime. Putin's address to the UN General Assembly in September 2015 marked a new phase of the conflict. He framed Syria's civil war as a struggle between the international order and terrorism. He likened it to what had happened in Chechnya. In a moment of moral equivalency, Putin maintained that both the government and the opposition were equally to blame for the violence. He proposed a broad coalition, likening it to the anti-Hitler coalition in the Second World War, which he said in his GA remarks could unite a broad range of parties to stand against those who, like the Nazis, so evil and hatred of humankind. Immediately after the UN General Assembly, on September 30th of 2015, Russia conducted its first airstrike in Syria. Russia's Ministry of Defense said it was targeting ISIS. However, the strikes predominantly hit anti-Assad opposition groups. Russia supported the regime and used its air power against the opposition forces. In February of 2016, US and Russia brokered a ceasefire, which the UN called the best hope for peace. Unfortunately, the ceasefire collapsed within 2 months. Predictably, Damascus blamed the collapse on rebels. Supporting Assad enabled Russia to achieve its strategic objectives: a large footprint in the Arab world, access to an air base in western Syria's Latakia province, 49-year lease of a naval air base in Tartus on the Mediterranean, and a privileged position for reconstruction contracts. Damascus and Moscow also signed an agreement giving Russia sole rights to extract oil and gas from lands controlled by the Syrian regime. That deal was penned in November of 2015. At the same time, Russia ramped up arms sales. It was delivering S-300 surface-to-air missiles in September of 2018 and other sophisticated offensive weaponry. Putin was animated by his resentment of the US and his personal dislike of Hillary Clinton. Putin bore a grudge against Clinton for condemning Russia's invasion of South Ossetia and a buildup in Abkhazia in 2008. Hillary Clinton scorned Bush's statement that he looked in Putin's eyes and got a sense of the man's soul. According to Clinton, Putin is a KGB agent and by definition doesn't have a soul. Clinton condemned Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. She compared it to the 1930s when Germany, under the Nazis' help, kept talking about how they had to protect German minorities in Poland and Czechoslovakia. She criticized Russian elections in 2012 for not being free and fair, in fact, being an instrument for Putin and his authoritarian government to consolidate their power and control. Putin took revenge. He interfered in the 2016 election to Clinton's detriment in the United States. Russia also reached out to Iran to forge cooperation on the battlefield in Syria. As a result of that initiative, Russia, Iran, and Turkey established the Astana process as an alternative to UN mediation. Russia drew a false distinction. Lavrov, foreign minister, claimed that the Astana process was about humanitarian issues, whereas Geneva focused on a political settlement. Astana was, in fact, really about marginalizing the US and the UN in service of Eurasian and Oriental interests. During this time, Iran also entered the battlefield and played an increasingly important role. Iran wanted to achieve its strategic objective, control of a corridor from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus and Beirut. The corridor is used to transport weapons to Hezbollah and other radical Palestinian groups committed to destroying Israel. Jordan's King Abdullah called it a Shiite crescent. Syria gives Iran strategic depth. To draw from a phrase of Ahmed Davutoglu, who was then foreign minister of Turkey. And the Shiite question also helps project power and influence. Syria was a counterweight to Saudi Arabia and a bulwark against Sunni influence. During this time, the Obama administration was focused on negotiating the JCPOA. It believed that confronting Iran would disrupt negotiations, although in my interview with Bill Burns, he maintained that there was no deference given to Iran in Syria with regard to the JCPOA. I think, moreover, Obama feared military intervention that would enhance Tehran's influence in Syria. So the US stepped to the side and didn't directly confront Iranian forces. Iran's mullahs called Syria the 35th province. Khomeini and Lavrov agreed to a joint military strategy when they met in May of 2015. When Qasem Soleimani, head of the Quds Force, visited Moscow on July 24 of 2015, he maintained there is still the possibility to reclaim the initiative. Soleimani presented a military plan. Russia would supply air power, upgrade its supply of weapons to the SAA, and deploy the IRGC and Basu members to the front line. He also recruited Hezbollah to join the battle. Hezbollah played a critical role on the front line. It led the fight in Qusayr on the border with Lebanon and Western Syria's Homs Governorate, and it consolidated control over the northern Kalamun region. By October of 2015, there were 7,000 IRGC and paramilitaries fighting in Syria. With their help, the Syrian Arab Army gained in Aleppo, in Dara, Qusayr, and the Al-Ghab plains. Some estimate Iran's financial assistance to the regime as up to $100 billion. It's documented that Iran spent $21 billion between 2012 and 2018, $16 billion during those years in military aid to paramilitary groups, and more than $6 billion in the form of a line of credit to the Syrian government to help Damascus withstand Western sanctions. Conflict between Israel and Iran came out of the shadows. Israel attacked the IRGC supply lines, transporting weapons to Hezbollah. In response to Katyusha missile attacks, Israel initiated a bombing campaign targeting the base of the Quds Force in Syria. In August of 2019, Israel attacked Iranian drones and conducted targeted killings of Shiite leaders in Western Iraq. During this time, US and Turkey relations were deteriorating. Turkey was a third wheel in the Astana process. It's important that we see Turkey and Erdogan with a steely-eyed and realistic perspective. Erdogan was always anti-democratic and Islamist. In a speech in Siirt in 1998, Erdogan said, "The mosques are our barracks, the domes are helmets, the minarets are bayonets, and the faithful are soldiers." He was sentenced to 6 months in jail for using religion to foment divisions. After the AKP won elections in 2002, Erdogan pronounced, "Democracy is like a streetcar. You get off when you've reached your destination." So the idea that Erdogan was a champion of democracy and secularism is a false idea that was propagated by Erdogan in order not to cross swords with the US and other Western powers. Despite Erdogan's rhetoric, the deterioration of US-Turkey relations accelerated in May of 2013 after Turkish security officials cracked down on protesters in Gezi Park. Police brutality spread to 60 cities across Turkey. Concerns about freedom of expression also intensified. Article 8 of the Anti-Terror Act and Article 301 of the Penal Code, which makes it a crime to denigrate Turkishness, were used to restrict freedom of expression. Many people, especially Kurds and opposition figures, were put in jail, charges based on these two anti-terror pieces of legislation. At the same time, Turkey's complicity with ISIS was a major concern. WikiLeaks quoted Clinton lamenting Turkey's new, more serious Islamic reality. During a speech at Harvard on October 3, 2014, then Vice President Biden said, "Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a Sunni Shiite proxy war that they poured hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of tons of weapons to anyone who would fight against Assad." Erdogan admitted to Biden, "You are right, we let too many of them through." The jihadi highway from Sanliurfa in Turkey to Raqqa became a major transit point, with up to 40,000 foreign fighters from 80 countries making their way to the front lines in Syria. Relations worsened with the coup on July 15th of 2016. Erdogan accused the US of complicity in the coup. Assad, in turn, accused Erdogan of using the coup to crack down on the opposition and justify his, quote, Muslim Brotherhood agenda. Turkey adopted a new constitution on the 16th of April, 2017, transforming its parliamentary system into a presidential one. The Venice Commission criticized Turkey's constitutional amendments as a dangerous step backwards, putting Turkey on the path to authoritarianism. US-Turkey relations deteriorated when Turkey joined the Astana process and also when it acquired S-400 missiles from Russia. As a NATO member, there is a principle that NATO countries have a uniform standard for the weapon systems that they use. Buying S-400 missiles violated that understanding, and it prompted the US to exclude Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter plane program, much to Erdogan's consternation. Erdogan was pedantic in drawing a line between Syrian Kurdish groups, the PYD, the YPG, and the YPJ, claiming that they were extensions of the PKK. It's true that up to 40% of PKK members originally came from Syria. But that doesn't mean that these Syrian Kurdish militias were working hand in glove with the PKK. Erdogan was outraged when Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announced a border security force that included 40,000 YPG members, Syrian Kurdish Defense Forces, to guard against incursions by ISIS from Syria. In response to the announcement by Tillerson, Erdogan threatened to strangle the baby before it was born. All this is occurring against the backdrop of America's failure to support the Kurds. Kobani was attacked by ISIS with support from Turkey in September of 2014. Kobani is a small city in Syria on the border with Turkey. And there's ample documentation, including by Turkish journalists, of artillery being fired from the hills above Kobani on the Turkish side of the border, and also the transport of missiles and other weapons by Turkey to ISIS during the battle for Kobani. The US initially concluded that, in Ryan Crocker's words, "We don't have a dog in this fight." But then it realized that if ISIS overran Kobani, they would execute hundreds of people. And this would be used as a recruiting tool by ISIS around the world. So the US airlifted weapons and medical supplies, enabling Kurdish forces to push ISIS out of Kobani after 4 months of fighting. House-to-house fighting was fierce and many died, but the Kurds proved their mettle in Kobani. This was noted by the Pentagon, which needed boots on the ground to fight ISIS and supported the YPG with weapons and aircraft as it pivoted east, attacking Tal Abyad on the Turkey-Syrian border. In August of 2016, Syrian Democratic Forces, which incorporated Syrian Kurdish militias, ousted the FSA from Manbij. By this point, Turkey had turned the FSA into a jihadist mercenary force, and the Syrian Kurds and the SDF evicted them at the behest of the US. In May of 2017, the SDF captured Raqqa, and 6,000 ISIS were killed in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. You may have seen some recent reports about how US air power attacked Raqqa. The battle there was fierce. This was the Alamo for ISIS. So many of them died there or ended up surrendering. The US support for Kurds was tactical. While supporting Kurds on the battlefield, the US acceded to Turkey's demand and barred Kurds in the PYD, the Democratic Union Party, led by Salih Muslim at the time, from attending diplomatic meetings in Geneva unless they joined the delegation of the Syrian Opposition Council. Salih Muslim applied for a visa at the US Embassy in Stockholm. He presented a letter of invitation from Columbia University and the Brookings Institution. However, the US Embassy never even gave him a reply. December of 2017, Trump and Erdogan had a phone call. Trump told Erdogan that the US was withdrawing. In response to that announcement, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis submitted his resignation. So did Special Envoy Brett McGurk. In January 20th of 2018, Turkey launched cross-border operations targeting Afrin, west of the Euphrates River. Turkey established a so-called safe zone in northern Syria, purging the area of Kurdish civilians and compelling the SDF's withdrawal. This targeting of Kurdish civilians continues to this day. When the US launched a constitutional committee, when the UN launched a constitutional committee in June of 2018, which Geir Pedersen, the UN Special Envoy, felt was critical to a political solution for Turkey. Turkey unabashedly, a political solution for Syria, Turkey unabashedly took steps to influence the selection of the committee's members and its agenda. In September of 2019, Erdogan announced that 3 million refugees would return to the de-escalation zone on the Syrian side of the border. Forced repatriation violates international norms, requiring a, quote, safe, orderly, and dignified return, which is voluntary. There was another phone call between Trump and Erdogan on October 6th of 2019. Trump told Erdogan that the US would be withdrawing from North and East Syria. Erdogan was quick to take advantage of this conversation. He didn't wait this time. And Turkey invaded on the 9th of October, occupying an area between Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. Trump announced that 2,000 special forces would leave Syria. Later, he backtracked, saying that 400 would remain to prevent the resurgence of ISIS and also to guard oil wells in eastern Syria. The US is a betrayal of the SDF, is a bloodstain on America's reputation, according to Senator Mitt Romney. Trump abandoned the SDF. As we noted earlier, Syrian Kurds lost 11,000 dead and 23,000 seriously injured at America's behest fighting ISIS. So after America's recent retreat from Afghanistan, Syrian Kurds feared that the Biden administration would cut and run, leaving them to reprisals by Turkey and jihadist forces. Ilham Ahmed, the president of the executive committee of the Syrian Democratic Council, met US officials in Washington in September of 2021 to discuss the continued cooperation between US Special Forces and the YPG and YPJ. She was assured that the US deployment in Syria would continue in order to destroy the Islamic State, to build infrastructure, and remain a player in the pursuit of a political solution. Biden wrote Speaker Nancy Pelosi, issuing an executive order indicating, quote, that actions by the government of Turkey to conduct a military offensive into northeast Syria undermine the campaign to defeat the Islamic State. It endangers civilians and further threatens to undermine peace, security, and stability in the region, posing an extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy goals of the United States. There are important lessons that we need to learn from what's happened in Syria. And that drama is still unfolding. And those lessons, we need to remind ourselves of those lessons repeatedly. First and most important is not to overpromise. When Obama said that Assad must go, he lacked a plan for getting rid of him or for installing a regime in Damascus after Assad was removed from power. We have to remember who our friends are and spend more time working in cooperation with our friends, in this case, the Syrian Kurds, than trying to placate our adversary, Arab groups, and Turkey itself. So as we look back over the 10 years since the Arab Spring swept the Middle East region in political change, we see many of the reforms that were envisioned by people during the Arab Spring are incomplete. In Syria, tragically, the regime has won the war. It is still launching offensives against the opposition. Turkey continues its support for the Free Syrian Army, which has evolved into a jihadist and mercenary group. So the US needs to recognize its indispensable role, needs to understand who are its allies, and it also has to recognize that by failing to support the non-sectarian democratic opposition, it opened the door to Turkey and Russia and Iran. So the tragedy of Syria continues. The death count continues to grow. The number of displaced is high and getting higher. Columbia University has launched a project with the Syrian Democratic Council to document war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law. Right now, there is no mechanism to hold the perpetrators accountable, but we feel it's important to have the documentation prepared and in hand so that when political conditions for accountability prevail, Syrians who have been victimized are ready and have a dossier that they can present to the international community with the goal of keeping the regime of Bashar al-Assad accountable, also ISIS, which perpetrated crimes, as well as Russia and Iran, who have targeted Syrians and have committed crimes themselves. So my book, Frontline Syria, is an account of what happened during these 10 years. It's a bare bones description of the role of great powers and the failure of great powers, especially the United States, to intervene constructively. Surely Syria will not be the last time that the US is called upon to intervene to prevent radicalization and to support a democratic movement. So I've written this book as an after action report so we can learn lessons from the Syria experience and hopefully do it better next time, not only in Syria, but in other countries that are evolving as part of a democratic movement, the last manifestation of the Arab Spring. So I think I will pause there. Maggie, you may have received questions. I may also have spoken too long, but I'd be pleased to hear questions from the audience. But thank you all for your attention.
I see here a question from Yusuf Ismail that says, what is Mr. Phillips' advice for the Kurdish groups, especially between Iraqi and Syrian Kurds?
So Kurds need to come together and recognize that they have a shared interest and that they share that interest with the United States and Western powers. There's been a rivalry among Kurdish groups. They need to set that rivalry apart, and they need to work in cooperation with one another in order to achieve a broader political objective. The US can help by facilitating dialogue, but ultimately it's up to the Kurds in Iraq and in Syria to come together, not only as a fighting force, but as a political movement which supports democracy and human rights. That's ultimately the source of reform and change. Thank you, Yusuf.
I have another question from Efia Fursten that says, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong, I apologize. It says, what do you see as the current role of the USA under the Biden administration for protecting minorities in Syria and ensuring democracy?
So rhetorically, the Biden administration is committed to protecting minorities in Syria. And we focused our discussion largely on Kurds, but we also need to recognize that there are Chaldeans, Armenians, and Christians who are minorities in Syria. We need to uphold their interests. We need to make it clear that the execution of Christians like Hebrin Khalaf, who is a Kurd killed by mercenaries associated with the Free Syrian Army, won't be tolerated. The US is still the primary power in the region. We just need to exercise that power with prudence and with principle so that we send the right message and do the right thing.
Thank you, David. Does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, please. Thank you.
So Maggie, I see that in the chat function, you've provided information about my book.
Yes.
Of course, as an author, I'd welcome the audience purchasing the book, but I wrote the book not because I wanted to drive book sales. I wrote the book because Syria's tragedy is something that we need to learn from. And if we learn from what happened in Syria, it's not too late to move Syria in the right direction or to apply those lessons learned to other situations with a comparable dynamic.
Yes, Ahmed, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you.
Hey, I just had a couple questions for Mr. Phillips. I was just wondering like what he learned most in writing the book and maybe what was like the most challenging part about writing the book.
Ahmed, it's good to see you. Let me just take note of the fact that Ahmed is from Sudan. He's at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and we are in regular contact about the coup in Sudan and how to restore the civilian government there. So Ahmed, I know you had a busy morning with your studies, but thanks for coming. So while I was singing your praises, I forgot what your question was. Could you tell me again?
Yeah, what did you learn most in writing the book and like what was most challenging about that or about writing the book?
So I interviewed a lot of US officials, so gaining access, gaining their trust, reflecting their views on the pages of Frontline Syria was a challenge. What I learned most is that the US needs to be steely-eyed in understanding that adversaries have malign intent, that Russia and Iran acted against not only US interests, but the interests of the Syrian people in pursuit of their own narrow strategic and security objectives. The US needs to have a principled and pragmatic approach, but it should always be based on a strong commitment to enforcing humanitarian values, defending defenseless victims, and providing relief and assistance to those who were displaced by armed conflict.
Sorry, Maggie, can I ask a question? I don't see the button to raise my hand.
That's okay. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Phillips. Again, this is the second question. I'm taking advantage of having you here. Turkey is an important, obviously, player. There is no solution without Turkey in Syria, to speak realistically. Do you see any prospect from the Turkish opposition post-Erdogan of opening up to the Kurds? And also, you know, most of the Syrian opposition are kind of Turkish proxies, and, you know, changing their position on the Kurdish groups, including opening talks with them and etc. Do you have any comments on that, please? Thank you.
Yusuf, thanks for your question. And also, thanks for your great work with the Washington Kurdish Institute. I'm really proud and honored to be a member of the Institute's board. And it's good to see you on the line today. Turkey is a malevolent force. It's pursuing its own interests. Oftentimes, when Turkey is criticized for human rights abuses or for imprisoning the opposition, as it has with Selahattin Demirtas, the HDP co-chair, Turkish officials beg for forgiveness. They say, we are a NATO member. NATO is more important to our collective interests than your support for human rights. I beg to differ. NATO is much more than a security alliance. NATO is a coalition of countries with shared values. And if Turkey applied to join NATO today because it is Islamist, anti-American, and hostile to human rights, its application wouldn't even be considered. So Turkey's neo-Ottoman ambitions in Syria, in Libya, its attack against Armenians in Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh are deplorable. There should be a tribunal or an international mechanism to hold Erdogan and his inner circle for liability and account. And we should just recognize that Turkey is no friend of the West, that Erdogan doesn't share values with Western countries. And the sooner we see Turkey for what it is, rather than how we wish it were, how it used to be, the better off US interests will be. So steely-eyed realism is called for when it comes to Turkey. Thanks for that question, Yusuf. Maggie, I think we may have time for one more question. Is there one?
Yes. We have a question from Rafaela Prifti, the reporter with the Sun Albanian American newspaper. So her question is, could Professor Phillips speak more on how is the US policy influenced through various administrations? Is it conflicting recommendations from think tanks? Is it the nature of foreign policy to be short-sighted, lobbying in DC? And she says that the question is in regard to Syria, but it could be also answered in a more general sense.
Thanks for that question. The US needs to have a consistent policy. From administration to administration, things change. And people around the world who look to the US for leadership, for protection, to support their nascent democracies, often wonder if the current administration and future administrations will change their approach and how safe and secure they can be. So whether we make democracy and human rights a centerpiece of our policy, or we're more focused on stability and security, people who are on the front line fighting heinous regimes want the US to be consistent, and they want to know that they can rely on Washington. After 4 years of the Trump administration, many of our friends and allies around the world were dismayed. I'm glad that the Biden administration is pursuing a more consistent and human rights-based policy in its international relations. but we were digging a deep hole over the 4 years of Donald Trump, and it's going to take some time to dig out. So there's much more work to be done, and we pledge our support for those efforts to promote human rights and democracy worldwide, and to work in cooperation with US officials who are trying to advance the goals of US interests, but also the goals and interests of people around the world who strive for freedom. Maggie, is there another question, or should we adjourn the session?
We have one more question. So the question is from F.F. Orson again. She says, I was wondering what you feel the US could do to help bridge healthy diplomatic relations between Syria and Iraqi Kurdish governments, as both are allies to the US. This question is in response to saying how important it is for Kurds to come together. She also says that she loved your book and she had the pleasure of reading your book on Syria and Iraq, and she highly recommends both.
Well, that's kind of you to say. What can the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, do with Kurds in Syria? The border should be open for humanitarian assistance. Kurds in Syria that are targeted and victimized need to have sanctuary in the region, including the Kurdistan region of Iraq. A great injustice was done to the Kurdish people at the Treaty of Versailles. Kurds were promised a referendum on independence, but it was never held. And that initiated a century of betrayal and abuse. So it's time to correct the record. It's time for the US to lead a more pro-Kurdish regional policy, recognizing that the Kurds are friends and allies. It's often said that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. That's a Kurdish adage. We should also recognize that the US has no better friend than the Kurds. And if we adhere to that approach, we'll find that our interests with Kurds align, not only in Syria, but in Iraq and the region, which includes Iran that has 8 to 10 million Kurds and Turkey that has 18 to 20 million Kurds. We just need to be realistic and we need to be morally principled. A morally based foreign policy that identifies US and Kurdish interests together will serve the interests of both nations. And knowing the experience that President Biden and Secretary Blinken have on Kurdish issues over many years, I expect that the US will pursue a more principled policy, which advances US interests in tandem with Kurdish interests. Well, Maggie, I think that we're at our adjourning time. So I'd like to thank you for moderating and for organizing today's event. I'd like to thank our guests for having joined. There are many friends on the line. I want to especially acknowledge my mother, Ann Phillips, is with us. So Mom, thank you for being a part of today's session. And I'm thrilled to be a part of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. It's a great place to learn, to teach, and also to apply lessons learned in practical terms to events around the world. No more important event than strengthening the US-Kurdish cooperation in Syria and in the region. So with that, I'll adjourn. Thank you all for coming. And if you buy my book and you want a signature, come to my office or my house. I'd be happy to sign it for you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.